On June 12, 1977, over 130 young Girl Scouts arrived at Camp Scott for a 2-week-long summer camp adventure. What was meant to be a peaceful, fun summer camp experience within hours turned into something horrific, terrifying, and honestly straight out of a horror movie. 3 young girls arrived at Girl Scout camp that fateful day in June of 1977, expecting 2 weeks full of fun and adventure at Camp Scott, but within one day of arriving at summer camp were found brutally murdered. To this day, it's one of the most brutal unsolved murders in Oklahoma history and possibly even one of the most disturbing in the entire country. Welcome back to another episode of Hot on the Case. If this is your first time joining us for an investigation, here at Hot on the Case, we talk all things true crime with a focus on the unsolved and unexplained. So if mysteries are your thing, please consider following the show wherever you are listening or watching, whether that's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or if you're watching the video version on YouTube. Please do not forget to like, rate, and review the show because it really does help it out. And if you're a returning listener or subscriber, thank you so much for being here. My name is Brianna and I'm hot on the case. Camp Scott was located at Locust Grove in Mays County, Oklahoma, about 3 hours east of Tulsa. The campsite rested on a few hundred acres of land and was in a very dense, isolated, thick wooded area. For decades, thousands of young Girl Scouts visited Camp Scott during their summers, and for those couple weeks, all of those young girls had great times at Camp Scott, made great memories there. But everything would change in the summer of 1977. On June 12, 1977, nearly 140 young girls arrived at Camp Scott. Amongst them were Lori Farmer, Michelle Guse, and Doris Milner. Lori Farmer was the youngest of the victims at only 8 years old. Lori was born on June 18, 1968, and was the oldest of 5 siblings. Lori was extremely smart since birth practically, and was even able to just skip the 2nd grade entirely. That summer, it seemed like everyone that Lori knew was going to summer camp, so of course I meant that Lori wanted to go to summer camp, and it would be her first year ever doing so. Lori and her mom were stuck choosing between 2 summer camps, the Girl Scout camp at Camp Scott, and also the summer camp that was being run by the local YMCA. Lori did not care which summer camp she went to, she just really wanted to go to summer camp. So ultimately, it was her mom who made the decision that Lori would be going to the Girl Scout camp at Camp Scott, a decision that has haunted her. Michelle Guse was born on July 22nd, 1967. She was only 9 years old. Michelle was also very smart. She was a very active and adventurous and athletic child. She loved to play soccer and play with her older brother, Michael. Michelle was also quite shy. She loved to read. She also had a bit of a green thumb. Michelle had her own plants that she meticulously looked after. Specifically, she loved her African violets. This summer would be Michelle's 2nd year in a row going to Girl Scout camp at Camp Scott after she really enjoyed her experience the previous summer. Before Michelle left for camp, she asked if her mom would remember to look after her prized violets. Doris Milner was only 10 years old, born on February 3rd, 1967. Doris was also incredibly bright, very academically gifted. She always got straight A's, and recently Doris had even been accepted into a really prestigious middle school for exceptional children. Starting this new school in the fall was something that Doris was really looking forward to. Doris was also really close with her younger sister, Kathleen. This was going to be Doris's first time ever going away for summer camp, and originally she was really excited for summer camp, but when some of the other girls that Doris was friends with that were originally planning to go to Camp Scott with her backed out last minute, any excitement that Doris had for summer camp was replaced with anxiety. She got really nervous. Doris didn't know if she wanted to go to Camp Scott anymore because she didn't know anyone else that was going, and she'd be away from her mom and her little sister for 2 entire weeks, which is a really long time for a little girl to be away from her family. And it was actually Doris's mom that convinced Doris that she should still go to summer camp, at least try it out. And she told Doris if she didn't like it, all she had to do was call home and they would come pick her up. And after dropping Doris off, her younger sister, who was only 5 years old, named Kathleen, just out of nowhere turned to her mom and asked her, What happens when people die? Her mom tried to answer this and explain this to her 5-year-old daughter, but then Kathleen asked her, what happens if everyone dies? Again, her mother tries to answer this in a way that would appease and calm down her curious child. But then Denise's 5-year-old baby sister turned to her mom and said, Mama, tomorrow everyone is going to die. And the very next day at Camp Scott, Denise, Lori, and Michelle would be murdered. Camp Scott was a very large camp that they separated into 11 or 10 smaller campsites, and they would separate the campers by age and by troop. Each of the camps were named after different Native American tribes, and within these smaller campsites, there would be 1 tent for the camp counselors and then 7 tents for the campers. Lori, Michelle, and Denise were assigned to Tent 7 in the Kiowa campsite. Sometimes online, their tent is said to be Tent 8, and it only depends whether or not you count the counselor's tent as Tent 1 or Tent 0. For the sake of this, I'm going to call their tent Tent 7, but I will have like some diagrams on the screen. If they say Tent 8, just know I'm talking about Tent 7. And I will have plenty of diagrams on the screen that will try to show you the layout of this campsite, but if you're only listening to the audio version of this show, I'll try to explain what this campsite looks like. So there's 1 tent for the camp counselors, 1 tent that anyone over the age of 10 years old is in. Following the counselor's tent, there are 7 tents for the campers, and those 8 tents form a half circle, meaning that Tent 7, the tent that Lori, Michelle, and Denise were in, was the farthest one away from the counselors. And not only that, their tent was the only one that was not visible from the counselor's tent, since there was a large kitchen, shower, storage facility in the middle of the campsite that completely obstructed the counselor's view from Tent 7. It's also hard to tell from just these drawings of how this campsite was laid out, just how far each of these tents were from each other. I read online that Tent 7 was nearly 300 feet away, or over 80 meters away from the counselor's tent. There's obviously so much wrong with this. These girls are far too young to be camping alone in the dense forest. When I went to summer camp as a kid, there was at least 1 or 2 counselors in each of our cabins. At the very least, the tents should have been closer together, and the camp counselors, who are literally only there to watch over these children and keep them safe, should have been able to have an eye on them at all times. The first night at Camp Scott was hit by a terrible rain and thunderstorm, so the first day of fun was cut short as all the little girls ran into their tents for the night. In their tent, Lori, Michelle, and Denise each wrote letters back home. Lori and Michelle wrote letters back home to their family, letters filled with joy and innocence you can only find in a child. Lori wrote, "Dear Mom and Dad and Misty and Joe and Chad and Kathy, we're just getting ready to go to bed. It's 7:45. We're at the beginning of a big storm and having lots of fun. I've met 2 friends, Michelle Guse and Doris Milner. I'm sharing a tent with them. It's starting to rain on the way back to dinner. We're sleeping on cots. I couldn't wait to write. We're all writing letters now because there's hardly anything else to do. With love, Lori." Michelle wrote, "Aunt Karen, how are you? I am fine. I am writing from camp. We can't go outside because it's storming. Me and my tent mates are in the last tent in our unit. My tent mates are Doris Milner and Lori Farmer. My room is in shades of purple. Love, Michelle." The most heartbreaking letter came from Denise, who, if you remember, was really nervous about coming to camp and didn't really want to go anymore and was convinced by her mother to try it out. Her letter read, "Dear Mom, I don't like camp. It's awful. The first day it rained. I have 3 new friends named Glenda, Lori, and Michelle. Michelle and Lori are my roommates. Mom, I don't want to stay at camp for 2 weeks. I want to come home and see Cassie and everybody. Your loving child, Doris Milner." During that first night at Camp Scott, many counselors and campers saw and heard some really bizarre, strange, and terrifying things. Before going to bed, the light from 3 flashlights could be seen coming from the woods by campers. During the night between 11:30 p.m. and 1:30 a.m., a counselor also saw what looked like a flashlight deep in the woods. During the night, some of the Kiowa camp counselors heard really odd moaning noises, like really deep guttural moaning noises. And the counselor said that it didn't sound human, but it also didn't sound like any animal they've ever heard before, just very bizarre. Around 1:30 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., some campers in the Kiowa camp woke up to flashlights being shined into their tent. And at least one camper remembered a man unzipping her tent and shining a flashlight inside before leaving. Around 3 a.m., campers from a nearby campsite woke up to the sounds of someone screaming. Little girls screaming, and from the sounds of someone calling out for their mom. And then all of these strange occurrences stopped completely all at once. Despite all these chilling things happening in the middle of the night, none of the counselors checked on each of the campers' tents. Maybe due to the terrible storm that night, or maybe because at the end of the day, counselors and campers alike, these were all just young girls in the middle of the wood alone. 6 a.m. the following morning, June 13th, one of the Kiowa camp counselors was up bright and early. By then, the storm had passed, and she headed to take a shower, where on the path, she saw a sleeping bag just left abandoned on the path in the middle of the campsite. She went to pick up the sleeping bag, thinking that maybe one of the campers had just accidentally dropped it on their way to bed in the dark, but inside of the sleeping bag was the body of 10-year-old Doris Milner. She was partially naked, bloody, and beaten. She was bound at the wrist, gagged, and there were tragic signs of sexual assault. Her cause of death was strangulation after being hit over the side of the head. 100 yards away in the woods were the bodies of Lori and Michelle. They were also found in their sleeping bags. They were also tied at their wrists, possibly gagged. Lori and Michelle had also been sexually assaulted, and their cause of death was blunt force trauma to their heads. Near their bodies was nylon rope, duct tape, and a red flashlight, as well as a pair of eyeglasses that had been stolen from another Kiowa camper's tent. Inside of the own girl's tent, blood was everywhere, and it looked like the attacker had even attempted to clean up the blood with towels and sheets, but gave up. A bloody 9.5 shoe footprint was also found inside of the tent. Immediately, the rest of the campers were told to pack up their bags, and they were loaded onto buses and sent home. Their families back home were not told which of their daughters would not be getting off of those buses. The investigation immediately begins, and during questioning, the investigators discover that a lot of bizarre and, frankly, looking back, haunting and terrifying things had been happening at Camp Scott leading up to the murders. Days before the campers arrived, many of the tents looked like someone had entered them, rummaged around. A week before, some of the camp counselors that were there setting things up, getting ready for the season, said that they saw someone out in the middle of the night in the woods with a flashlight. Some felt that this person was following them. A man was also witnessed in the wood near the camp on many occasions. 2 weeks before the camp started, supplies from the camp began to go missing. Strange noises could be heard coming from the forest in the middle of the night. 2 months before the murders, the camp counselors were at Camp Scott for some on-site training. During this time, things began to go missing, food was stolen, and several counselors reported that their belongings looked rummaged through. And probably the most terrifying of them all, a notebook at camp was found. The first 3 pages, the word kill was written on it over and over and over. It feels like something out of a slasher film, but it gets worse. On the 4th page of the notebook read, "We are on a mission to kill 3 girls in tent 1. This threat was found at Camp Scott 2 months before 3 little girls were murdered at this camp, but it was dismissed as a prank done by some of the teenage counselors. And despite all of these strange things happening at the summer camp, things going missing, things stolen, and now literal death threats, not a single report was ever made to the police. Search dogs led investigators to a local farm. The farmer, Jack Schuff, was under some initial suspicion because some of the items used in the murders, like the nylon rope and duct tape, had come from his property. And although it was later proven that Jack Schuff had an airtight alibi, he was concretely out of town at the time of the murders, he passed a polygraph, and that these items had actually been stolen off of his farm by the real perpetrator, meaning that he was just cleared of this crime entirely. His initial connection to this terrible crime ruined his reputation. The local newspaper printed a photo of him with the headline, "Slayer," leading many people to believe that he was guilty of the rape and murder of 3 little girls. It got so bad that eventually Jack Schuff had to be hospitalized after suffering a nervous breakdown. But very quickly, the sheriff and the investigators had a new theory and a new prime suspect. When the local sheriff began thinking about different criminals from the local area, his mind initially went to a man named Gene Leroy Hart. Gene was a 34-year-old Native American Cherokee man serving a 309-year prison sentence at the local county prison for burglary and also the 1966 kidnapping and rape of 2 pregnant women. But in 1973, Gene Hart escaped from prison and had been uncaught and on the run for the past 4 years before the murders happened at Camp Scott. Gene was very familiar with the area. He actually grew up only 1 mile from Camp Scott, and his previous crimes that he was convicted of had some striking similarities to the Girl Scout murders. So in 1966, when Gene was 22 years old, he kidnapped 2 pregnant women. He brought them to the isolated remote wilderness at gunpoint, where he tortured and raped them repeatedly. In this attack, he also used nylon rope and duct tape, just like in the Girl Scout murders. His victims also recall him making a very deep, bizarre, guttural, moaning noises during the sexual assault, just like the noises that were heard in the middle of the night where Lori, Michelle, and Denise were sexually assaulted and killed. Both of these women also wore glasses, and during the attack, Gene took off their glasses and wore them. And if you remember, in the Girl Scout murders, another camper's glasses were stolen from her tent and left near the bodies. So was this like a thing for Gene? And because of these striking similarities between these crimes, Gene has a history of violent sexual crimes, and because he was from this area, he was familiar with this area, it was no wonder that he could possibly be thought to be the one responsible. But it is important to note, Gene being thought as being responsible for the Girl Scout murders was only a theory, and it was talked about before they actually found any evidence against him. And boy, did they find evidence. Search dogs led investigators to a set of 3 caves that were only a short distance from Camp Scott. And it appeared like someone had been living inside of these caves or hiding out in these caves. And interestingly enough, these caves were a mere 100 feet from Gene's childhood home. And for anyone not from the United States, that would mean that these were only 30 meters away from the home that Gene was raised in. Inside one of the caves was a pair of sunglasses that were also stolen from a camper at Camp Scott, duct tape that matched duct tape used during the crime, women's underwear, and newspaper that matched newspaper that was found at the scene. There was some newspaper crumbled up and was kind of like pushed inside of the red flashlight that was found near the victims' bodies. They also found in the cave the photos of 2 different women. In another one of these caves on the wall was written 77-6-17, "The killer was here, bye fools." And I've read online that this note written on the wall is kind of on the nose, what killer leaves a "I was here" note for someone to find. But especially back in the day, it was not uncommon for killers to leave notes for the police, to taunt the police. You just think about the Zodiac killer, and there's so many more. Also, if you believe that the killer was also the one that left behind that note at camp 2 months before the murders happened, the kill, and the "we are on a mission to kill 3 girls" notes, maybe leaving behind these terrifying notes was a part of this killer's MO. And because in these caves they found items from the crime scene from Camp Scott, it was believed that whoever was hiding out in these caves was the killer. And they had those 2 photos of those 2 women that were found in the cave as well. So investigators broadcasted those photos everywhere, hoping to identify those women and hence hopefully identify their killer. A prison employee who was also a photographer on the side came forward and claimed that he was the one who took those 2 photos. And he said that he developed them in the same dark room that Jean worked in at prison. This was enough for the investigators to believe that they had linked this crime to Jean Leroy Hart, and a massive manhunt began for Jean. The manhunt was actually the largest in the state's history at the time and cost the state over $1 million in today's money. And then 10 months after the Girl Scout murders on April 6, 1978, Jean Leroy Hart was found and arrested. A fellow Cherokee man had been hiding him out in his home. When Jean was arrested, he was wearing women's glasses, and he was also in possession of more items that were stolen from Camp Scott. As he was being arrested, the first thing he said was, "You'll never pin it on me." Shockingly, Jean's arrest came with outrage from the local Native American community, with many believing that he was innocent and that he was only being suspected of this crime because of racism. Remember when I told you that Jean being a suspect was just a theory before they actually found any evidence against him? Well, many of Jean's supporters believe that he was actually being framed by the racist police who just wanted to close this case as fast as possible. His supporters claimed that the items found in the caves were all planted, as well as the items that were found on Jean from Camp Scott. Those were planted as well. When Jean's trial began in March of 1979, Jean's supporters flooded the courtroom. Up to 400 of the local citizens crowded in the courtroom every day to support Jean. Fundraisers were held to help pay for his defense team. And this was so shocking and hurtful for the families of Lori, Michelle, and Denise, who just lost their daughters in the most horrific and brutal way. They said every single day they went into court and they were made to feel like they were the enemies by Jean's supporters. During the trial, the prosecution was not allowed to point out the similarities of the crime that Jean was previously convicted of and of the Girl Scout murders. Regardless, they felt like they had plenty of evidence against Jean and were confident that they had enough to convict him. And some of this evidence was even DNA evidence. The prosecution claimed that a hair that was found on Denise's body was an exact match to Jean's. And after some more recent DNA testing, it is believed that this hair came from a Native American man. This science that was used to match this hair to Jean is now considered junk science. Prosecution also claimed that semen that was found on each of the victims was a match for Jean Hart. This DNA evidence has been scrutinized and also tested over and over again throughout the years. Unfortunately, due to the limited science at the time, a conclusive match could not be made, but they were able to tell that this semen came from a non-white man with type O blood. This matched Jean, who was a Native American man with type O blood. It wasn't a 100% match, but this DNA could have only come from 0.002% of the world's entire population. So the prosecution thought that this was a slam dunk. What were the odds of another Native American man with type O blood being in the area that also committed violent sexual crimes? The defense argued that the evidence against Jean was flimsy, planted, or both, and that there was actually evidence found at the scene that directly went against Jean being the killer, like fingerprints that were found at the scene that did not match Jean, and also that shoe print that was found in the tent was too small to be Jean's. The defense actually brought forth their own suspect, a man named William Stevens, another local convicted criminal who lived near the camp. Some of the campers reportedly claimed to have seen William Stevens at camp after they were shown a photo of him. A friend of William's testified that William borrowed a flashlight of hers shortly before the murders, and she never got this flashlight back. When shown photos of the red flashlight that was found at the crime scene near the bodies of Lori and Michelle, she said that this was the flashlight that William Stevens had borrowed from her. Another witness testified to seeing William shortly after the murders took place and that he was all scratched up. He had scratches over his arms and on his face, and that William had what looked like blood on his shoes. A cellmate of William's also claimed that William confessed to being the one that killed Lori, Michelle, and Denise at Camp Scott. But in 1984, while in prison for an unrelated rape, William was stabbed to death by another prisoner. William was never truly investigated at the time as a suspect, and because he is now dead, he never can be. And Jean's defense claimed that the reason that he was never investigated at the time was due to racism and lazy police work, and that they were just trying to pin and frame this on Jean, an innocent man. And after only 5 minutes of deliberating, 5 minutes, the jury came back. Jean Leroy Hart was not guilty for the rape and murder of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guse, and Doris Milner. When the verdict was read, Jean put his head in his hands and began to cry. His supporters had the audacity to stand up and cheer like they were watching sports, like this was some game. Absolutely disgusting behavior. It's a trial for 3 little girls that were sexually assaulted and killed, and you're gonna stand up and cheer? In front of 3 families who lost their children, you're going to cheer. Jean was sent back to prison to serve out his 300-year prison sentence for those previous crimes that he committed. But only 2 months later, at the age of 34 years old, Jean Hart had a heart attack and died. Many of his supporters believed that he was actually poisoned, that he was killed. His funeral was attended by over 1,300 people and was the largest in the county's history. Investigators chose not to investigate any further because they truly did believe, despite the acquittal, that Jean Hart was the true killer. This case continues to baffle and haunt everyone connected to it and everyone that hears of this unimaginable crime. Over the years, more and more tests have been done on that DNA that was found on the victims' bodies, but because DNA degrades over time, there's never been a 100% conclusive match to anyone. There has never been a 100% conclusive match to Jean Hart, although all these tests have never been able to rule him out, and all the tests actually strongly suggest that this is his DNA. In 2022, after more DNA testing, which although could not conclusively point to Jean as the killer, investigators say that this recent DNA testing has ruled out every other single possible suspect except one, Jean Hart. So officially the case is closed, but officially it remains unsolved. Also in May of 2022, a 4-part docuseries about this case premiered on Hulu, and it was hosted by the singer, actress, and Wicked star Kristen Chenoweth. At the time of the murders, Kristen was just 8 years old and also a Girl Scout herself. She actually planned to attend the exact same camping trip at Camp Scott, but fell ill shortly before and had to stay home. This is really chilling and eerie considering that most of the tents at Camp Scott were filled with groups of 4 Girl Scouts, but the one that held Lori, Michelle, and Denise had just the 3 of them. Many theories have been thrown around in this case over the decades. One theory I find the most interesting is the theory that there was possibly more than one perpetrator. A lot of people actually believe, and there's some evidence that suggests that possibly a female was involved in the Girl Scout murders, with many people pointing to possibly a Camp Scott employee or a Camp Scott counselor. This is a theory that Lori Farmer's own mother believes could be true. She said that she's always felt like a woman was involved, possibly a Camp Scott employee. I know a lot of people think that this could be true as well if you believe that that note that was written in the notebook during the on-site training for the camp counselors, the one that said that they're going to kill 3 little girls at camp, that this could point to camp counselors, one or more than one, being involved in the Girl Scout murders. From my research, I couldn't find a definitive answer if they ever looked into all of the camp counselors and camp employees. I would assume that they did, but since I couldn't find any conclusive answers on that, a lot of people still theorize that to this day. Camp Scott was closed the day after the brutal murder of Lori, Michelle, and Denise and has never reopened. I want to hear all your thoughts and theories in the comments, but please remember to be respectful and to remember Lori, Michelle, and Denise, 3 little girls who were full of life and full of promise, who never made it past their first night at summer camp. Nearly 5 decades have passed since that tragic night at Camp Scott. Today, many people believe that they know what happened and they know who is responsible. A suspect who is either a cold-blooded killer or the perfect scapegoat. The truth, it's still out of reach, and this case today officially remains unsolved. And if you made it to the end of this week's episode of Hot on the Case, thank you so much for listening to Lori, Michelle, and Denise's story. I'm interested to hear all of your thoughts and theories, so please keep discussing with me in the comments. And please, if you have a second, make sure that you are subscribed on YouTube and following the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts so you won't miss next week's episode of Hot on the Case. Please make sure that you like the video on YouTube and you rate and review the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, because it really does help the show and it helps push out these cases and these victim stories to even more people. Thank you guys so much for all of your support so far on the show, and I will see you guys all next week when we are hot on the case once again.